And I hope you'll enjoy hearing a little bit about the research that perhaps isn't surfaced as much in the programme website. So presenting today are a team from the Natural History Museum. I'm Lucy Robinson. I'm the Deputy Head of the Centre for UK Nature. And I lead our community science research programme, which includes all the science research for the National Education Nature Park. Presenting with me today are two of our postdoctoral researchers, Victoria Burton and Alexa Vara. And also we have a group of Masters and PhD students working with us on the programme. And one of those, Junyan Gao, is also going to present today. The Nature Park is a partnership programme. We're funded by the Department for Education with a whole suite of supporting partners. And we work with Esri UK as the provider of the ArcGIS mapping tools that we use to gather the scientific research data. So you'll hear a little bit more about those in this webinar. I'm going to very briefly summarise the programme, but I want to leave most of the time for you to hear from our researchers. So this is just the top line facts. One of the major goals of the programme is to achieve biodiversity gains across the educational estate. So we're really trying to achieve real world change. So today we'll be describing how we're approaching that and sharing a bit about our progress during the first 2 years of the programme. Here are some headline figures from the project. It's fair to say we're very pleased with the uptake so far. We've had 2 academic years of being active in schools. We're really pleased with the sign-up rate, but also really importantly, that conversion from registering for the programme to actually using the digital tools to participate in community science research and data gathering. So more than 3,000 settings have drawn their site boundary on our map, and more than 1,000 have started baseline habitat mapping. So we're really pleased to see that conversion rate. We're focusing on the science research in this webinar today. So if you want to find out more about the wider programme, I'll point you towards our annual report, our website, and there's a whole range of webinars like this one covering different aspects of the programme. So do take a look at those. To summarise how the Nature Park programme is experienced by young people and their teachers, they work through this 5-step cycle. So they start with getting to know their space, spending time outdoors, understanding what their space offers for nature and for themselves, and then identifying opportunities to improve their outdoor spaces, making decisions, actually implementing change on their site to enhance their habitats for nature, and then recording those changes and monitoring the impact of their work. And they go around this cycle, iteratively improving their space. There's a core spine of community science research that fits around this. So in that first getting to know your space stage, this is baseline, habitat and land cover, recording, understanding what they've currently got, some biological recording using iNaturalist, and we have some particular biodiversity surveys. At the moment, it's a pollinator count, and that will grow over time as we develop new surveys. They can view their data using a tool called the Atlas and therefore make evidence-based decisions using the data they've already gathered about their sites, about where they want to focus their efforts. And then we provide guidance on improving or creating habitats, and that draws from lots of expert evidence from our peer organisations, probably some of you in the audience today. And then they continue to understand their impact by continuing that biological recording and those biodiversity surveys. Schools add their enhancements onto a digital map so we can see the type and the extent of the habitat enhancements that they've implemented. So in terms of actually measuring biodiversity gains that they've achieved, I'm sure you can appreciate there are many challenges to doing this. And so we're addressing it in 2 different ways. The first is the on-the-ground data gathering using community science approaches, looking at habitats and species and the extent of the habitat enhancements that they're making. And our postdoc Victoria will tell you more about that in a minute. The second angle is drawing on the research, on the existing literature, past research, to understand what gains we're likely to see through different habitat enhancements. And Alexa will introduce that research to you. So before I hand over, I'll just say a few words about the data. We're very deliberately designing the project to gather data that aligns with data collected through professional means or through wider national recording schemes, so that the nature park data don't exist in isolation. The habitat categories we're using are derived from and they align with UK HABs. Our pollinator count is adapted from the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme, the flower insect timed count, and we developed our survey in partnership with the national scheme leads. And we're about to embark on a very small-scale environmental DNA pilot on just a couple of sites. And again, we're aligning that with the protocols that exist within the Bioscan project. So we're really trying to make our data as comparable to and interoperable with wider schemes as possible. All the scientific data are open licensed, and we're developing a tool that will support easy access to the data, so it can be downloaded or ingested into other systems as appropriate. As well as making the data available, of course, for the schools to use for their own analyses and to inform their own decisions. So I'll stop there and hand over to Victoria to introduce to you her aspect of the research.
Hello everyone. Yes, so as Lucy says, habitat mapping is one of the key ways we are collecting data on the educational sites. So we don't really know much about the habitats and biodiversity on the educational grounds. It's one of kind of a bit of unknown. It's not something that generally is surveyed among the England various schemes. So to do this, we developed tools with along with Esri's ArcGIS tools. So on the and as Lucy says, using habitat schema that align with the existing England UK HABs and urban greening scheme. So on the next slide, you can see some of the activities and flowcharts that we developed to help guide the educators and their learners to identify the different habitats. So these consist of a series of flowcharts and associated activities to help them identify. From this example, ground without plants, it's sort of whether it's a permeable or impermeable surface, if it's artificial or human-made materials, and a lot of these link into various curriculum topics as well. So that obviously encourages the teachers to do it within school time rather than having to do it, say, extracurricular task. And we're really pleased with the uptake this year. We've put extra promotional focus and into making sure everything is clear and easy to follow as possible, and following up on feedback from our regional teams who deliver it on the ground with the schools, and feedback from the teachers themselves. And if you have a look at the next slide, we can see we're actually up to over 1,100 habitat maps as well. You can see an example of one of those on the screen. They map a mixture of areas such as playing fields or lawns, or these non-natural and permeable surfaces, so sort of playgrounds, and also linear surfaces such as the hedges or pathways, and points as well. So plants in a pot, as you can see on this one, also individual trees and other small scale features. And actually, when I've analysed how much of these have actually covered their site, over 240 of them we can consider complete, so more than 80% of the actual site is covered. So we're really pleased on how the uptake of this, because it can be, if the site's large, a fairly involving task, and over multiple sessions often. and we were sure how teacher would take up the task. So we're really pleased to see how the feedback has been on the activities, and how much data has been coming on. And on the next slide, we've starting to get some insights on what the data is on the habitat types on the school sites. And as you might expect, the top sort of categories are the playing fields and lawns and the playgrounds. So these are the largest areas of habitats on the schools. There's also a fair amount of woodland, so over a kilometre squared of woodland has been mapped, and a fair amount of meadow, and not inconsiderable number of wildlife ponds as well, and hedges, and also so these different wildlife interventions, bat boxes and bird boxes. And this is baseline as well. This is before they've been putting in all these interventions that are being encouraged through the National Education Nature Park. And there's been a few surprises as well. A couple of schools actually grazing livestock on their sites. Reed beds a little bit more common than we expected. Schools using sustainable drainage systems. So it's been really interesting to start seeing that, and I'm looking forward to analysing that more detail over the summer, where the schools have been taking their break. And so if we go on to the next things, you might ask, why do we need the data? There's quite a lot of satellite data out there now, and also satellite data products based on that. But of course, they're on much coarser resolution than what schools can map on the ground. There's a nice example here of the Land Cover Map 2022 product, and the same map on one of our schools that have mapped their site. It's a particularly nice map done by the Co-op Academy, Manchester. And you can see, for a start, the resolution is much lower, but there's also sign of errors. So it's mapped some things as arable land, where clearly they're not. They've come up as the schools map them as ground without plants, as a playground, and it's popped up a pixel as freshwater, which we can see from the map the school's done, that there isn't a freshwater area then. But obviously there's going to be lots of potential for satellite data, and I'm going to be looking into ways that how we could use these to complement each other in places where we're not going to get schools mapping all their sites, or perhaps the maps are incomplete, and how we can use these to inform one another. So moving on, and how can we actually use these habitat data to move up to how much or what biodiversity is on the educational sites? Well, once we've got the habitat areas, the plan is to use that to estimate what the likely biodiversity is on the school sites from data from similar sites where we do have biodiversity data. And we can do this using, say, the Predicts database, which is held at the museum, a very large database, over 500 researchers contributed now, over 50,000 sites, and actually over 2% of named species now. It's global, so we need to probably match it down to England or maybe Western Europe, and match up those school habitats which have equivalent sites, and use those areas and estimate from those what the possible biodiversity is on the school sites. But of course, we want to actually measure biodiversity as well, so we do have some other methods as well. Oh yes, I nearly forgot, mapping changes. So as I mentioned, this is just the baseline habitats the schools are measuring. They've also been mapping all the lovely changes they've been making to their site as a result of the nature park. So this is an example of before and after of one of the sites, been putting in more greenery and beds, and they've been mapping these changes on another tool. So eventually we'll be able to see all the differences in habitat, and once we've got estimates of biodiversity, we'll be able to also estimate those increase in biodiversity from those changes. But as I say, we want to measure other measures of biodiversity rather than actually estimating from habitats, which of course there's errors around that. And so we have some methods schools have been doing to measure biodiversity on their site as well. And of course, that also gets them to be able to interact with biodiversity and learn about what's living on their sites. So one of the methods we've been using is the tool iNaturalist, so either with the app or uploading their photographs directly to the website. So some of the schools have been taking up this very enthusiastically with their classes and have actually observed over 4,000 different observations now and over 1,000 taxa. And some of my highlights from the year are on the screen. So there's one school, St Bartholomew's in Newbury, who've been doing moth trapping, and they found this particular moth, olive crescent, which is not one I've ever seen before actually, and is quite uncommon. So that was a very exciting thing to pop up, and shows that, you know, school sites, you know, can have some quite interesting species on them. And another one, some Corrie Primary School, have been doing some pond dipping and had some lovely photographs of what they've been found doing that. And this one was particularly exciting for me because it's one of the water frog tadpoles rather than the common frog tadpole, so it's a bit chunkier than usual. And who doesn't love tadpoles anyway in pond dipping? So that was really happy for me to see. And we've got a little summary here of some of the observations seen as well. And as you, it's actually quite common over iNaturalist overall. Plants are dominating. You know, they don't move, they're quite nice and easy to photograph. And the insects also popular, and it's really great to see. But actually quite a nice range of taxa there, even protozoa and algae popping up there, which is really lovely. And iNaturalist is really great at getting to that stage of finding out what's on your site. But we also want some more structured surveys so we can really compare before and after these interventions. So we've developed the pollinator count, which is based on UK pollinating monitoring schemes, flower insect time count. So this is Esri Surveys 123 tool, but we also developed an offline paper version because not everyone has Wi-Fi across their schools. So this launched spring last year, but after feedback and testing from some of the primary schools, we also launched a simpler survey this year with reduced numbers of groups to identify and count, and a shorter survey time, so 5 minutes rather than 10 minutes. We've also been doing a lot of work going into schools and observing how well they're counting and identifying them. And this year we had a master's student looking at that as part of the project, June Young, and she's going to talk a little bit about some of her findings next. Do you, June?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. We measured how well do young people count insect groups with the mean absolute error. That's just the average of the absolute difference between what kids counted and the expert count. It as the average number of insects off. Looking group by group, beetle came out on top. Kids were only off 0.7 insects on average. At the other end, other fly had the biggest gap, 7 insects off, so lots of overcounting and undercounting. Across all 10 insect groups and 23 observations, the overall mean absolute error was 4.07 insects with a standard deviation of 1.87, telling us both the typical distance and how much that distance varies. And with that, I will hand it to Victoria.
Thank you. And we're also starting to look at what groups are more often confused by others. So, yeah, I'm going to hand over to Alexa to look at her work.
Hi everybody, good afternoon. So I'm Alexa and I'm looking at the other aspect, the other way that we're looking at biodiversity and the nature park. And so we're using studies that other people have done and that they have published in the peer-reviewed literature. And we're taking their findings and we're using them to estimate what happens to biodiversity when you do some of these interventions in schools to predict what schools might find. And the way we're doing that is through systematic review and meta-analysis. And so basically what we aim to do is to first of all summarize all the kind of impacts that people have found when they've done their studies. And then once we've summarized those to give kind of one overall impact, we can then use those to predict what might happen in schools. So on the next slide, we will have a look at like a little schematic that I've done to sort of explain how this first bit works. So this first bit is the systematic review of the literature. And if you imagine that that sort of grey blue circle is all the literature, so that's all the little studies that people have done, sometimes big, but mostly for these sorts of interventions, they're really small studies. And what we hope to do is find a representative sample. I can't possibly look at all the studies, there are too many, but if we get a representative sample, we can use that to work out what they found on average. So for example, for planting wildflowers, we might develop some search techniques that get from all the literature that's out there some useful studies that are about planting wildflowers. And we'll do the same for wildlife ponds, and we'll do the same for planting trees. And so you can get the data for each of these different interventions. And then let's take planting wildflowers as our example. So on the next slide, we'll just sort of take you through the process using this intervention. So when you look at all the individual studies that are about planting wildflowers, you find that they find different outcomes. So not all the studies will show the same thing. So some studies will show, for example, let's take butterflies. They might show an increase in the number of butterflies or an increase in the number of different butterfly species as a result of planting wildflowers. But other studies might find no change, so that's a little sideways arrows. And some studies might even find that if you plant wildflowers, you find fewer butterflies. So we find these really divergent effects across all the many studies that are out there. And that's partly to do with the fact that quite often the studies are really small. And so next slide, please, Lucy. What we try and do in the second phase of this is the meta-analysis part of it. So we've done our systematic review, we've got all our studies, and now we use meta-analytic models that allow us to put in one model lots of different kind of measures of biodiversity from lots of different methods. It accounts for all that difference, and it allows us to estimate one overall effect size. And so far for planting wildflowers, we're finding that the overall effect sizes are positive. They increase biodiversity, which is that up arrow there. Next slide, please, Lucy. And so obviously we're not just doing this for butterflies. We will do it for different biodiversity groups. So we might look at pollinators, butterflies, beetles. We can only do what's out there in the studies. If no studies have looked at the effect of planting wildflowers on snakes, then we can't get an estimate of the effect for snakes. But we do it for as many groups as we can, depending on what we find in the literature. And then the next part of the process is once we've got these overall average effect sizes, we can use those to predict what might happen in schools if they planted wildflowers. So for example, and this depends on the underlying data, it depends on what's in all the studies that we've used, but we might be able to say, okay, if you plant a patch of wildflowers in 5 years' time, you might expect to see this increase in the number of butterflies or this increase in the number of biodiversity in general. Or we might be able to say something like, okay, if you plant a 4 by 1 meter patch of wildflowers, you'll see this effect. But if you plant a 6 by 1 meter, flower bed with wildflowers, you might see this effect. So again, those nuances depend on the underlying data. Depends what we can predict for the schools. And then we can also predict this for other interventions. Next slide, please, Lucy. So eventually, at the moment, we've just done the planting wildflowers because it's a lot of work and that's how long it takes. But we hope that we will, in the future, also be able to do it for other interventions. So hopefully we might be able to start grasses in the autumn. We'd like to be able to do it for other things like wildflower ponds or planting trees. And so eventually schools should be able to have some sort of idea about what might happen if they did wildflower planting, or if they did tree planting, which one in their context is better for biodiversity? Next slide, please, Lucy. And so the method that we use to do this systematic review and then the meta-analytic models is already published. And the reason we publish it is to make it transparent, completely reproducible, and make sure our results are really robust. And that's part of ensuring that our findings are really rigorous and we're providing actually reliable estimates to schools. And then finally, I wanted to finish by showing you some results that we've found for wildflowers so far. So we've had 2 great master's students working on looking at pollinator responses to wildflower plantings. So Ruby Chesney-Spedding was with us last summer. She was a brilliant master's student, and she looked at what happens to pollinators if you plant wildflowers in towns. And she found that pollinator abundance, that's how many pollinators are there, goes up by 109%. And then those figures in brackets are just the range. Because obviously we've used lots of different studies and they found different sizes. So we've got our average effect and then the range. And then for pollinator richness, that's how many different pollinator species are there. She found that if you plant wildflowers in towns, that goes up by 46%. And again, there's the range. And then we've got a master's student currently working on this project called Yi Wang. And she's looking at the context that you plant wildflowers in. So she's not focusing just on towns, she's looking at everywhere and then looking at different contexts. And she's found that for pollinator abundance, if you plant wildflowers in a town or in the country, it doesn't make any difference. You get the same increase in the numbers of pollinators in both of those contexts. But for pollinator richness, you get a bigger increase if you plant wildflowers in towns than you do when you plant wildflowers in the countryside. And she's also looked at how much semi-natural habitat is around where the wildflowers are being planted. So kind of nearby habitat might be, you know, somewhere on the edge of a town, or it might be in the countryside, you know, a bit of woodland left or whatever it might be. And she's found that for pollinator abundance, if you've got more semi-natural habitat around you, you actually get a smaller increase when you plant flowers in the number of pollinators. But the opposite response for richness. So in terms of the number of different pollinator species, if you've got a lot of semi-natural habitat around you, you get a boosted response. So you get a larger response. So some really interesting findings, and those sorts of things are what will help us make context-specific predictions for individual schools. So watch this space. We hope that by the end of the autumn, we will be able to publish the results for wildflower planting for all groups, all biodiversity groups, and hopefully we can start doing some more interventions as well. Thanks very much.
Thanks. It's super interesting to hear all that research and to be able to share that with everyone. So to finish off, I'll highlight a few things that are coming up in the next academic year for us. The Nature Park Atlas will be available from September. So this will be a map-based visualization of all the community science data that's been collected so far, and you can turn on and off different layers. So it'll help young people and their teachers to visualize data in different ways. And we're also developing a tool for downloading the data. So we'll be sharing that, especially amongst peer audiences when that's ready, because it's not just for schools to access the data, it's for everybody to be able to access the data that we're collecting. We're currently developing a grassland plant survey, which we're hoping to launch next spring. As has been mentioned, grassland habitats is one of the main habitats that schools have, and one of the key interventions that we've been recommending is enhancing that, either by just letting your grass grow long or by deliberately enhancing the species richness of a grassland with targeted planting. So we'll then be launching a study to understand the quality of grasslands across school sites. Those of you who work in this area might have already participated in a workshop we had last summer to start kicking that off, and we'll be having more consultations over the months ahead. And finally, our annual report for this academic year that's just come to a close will be out in October. So I really encourage you to read that to hear much more about the wider programme and all of the incredible achievements of the young people, the children and their teachers that we've been working with over the past 2 years. So thanks for attending today. I hope that's given a useful insight into our research. We look forward to sharing much more as our research progresses in the coming months and years. So thanks for your time today and have a great summer.